The music you've been hearing comes from Carl Davis's choral work, Last Train to Tomorrow. It was composed 10 years ago to commemorate the Kindertransport, that remarkable, largely improvised rescue effort which brought thousands of Jewish children from Nazi Europe to Britain in 1938 and 39 on the very brink of war. I was one of them, and today I want to tell you my story. Of course, hundreds of thousands of children never had the chance to make it to safety. They were left behind and later, with their parents and grandparents, faced deportation and near certain death. The Nazis created a regime of systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder worse than any the world had seen. It killed 2 out of every 3 European Jews, and hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people too. The Nazis called it the final solution. We call it the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew for catastrophe. A week on Saturday is Holocaust Memorial Day. The candle marks Britain's promise to remember the millions who suffered. And candles play a part in many different cultures. Their effect is soothing, and they act as symbols of light amid the darkness of life. There is a purpose in these ceremonies, in the act of remembering. The Holocaust was the worst genocide in history. One of its lessons is that genocides don't just happen. They only occur when people stand by, afraid to speak out, or worse, when they are indifferent. And by remembering the Holocaust, we keep the knowledge of it and the lessons that it can teach us alive in our minds and in our wider discourse. It is my privilege to deliver this 22nd Holocaust Memorial Lecture at this university, albeit virtually. And I thank you for inviting me. I'm not an academic, but believe my talk will be valuable to social historians. The Jewish population in Scotland is small. It's possible that the first Jews arrived in the country in the 12th century, fleeing persecution in England. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Jews settled here in any numbers. The first Jew graduated from this university in 1797. There's been a Jewish congregation here in Glasgow since 1821, and the historic Cathedral Synagogue of Scotland at Garnet Hill. There's also a memorial in Queen's Park in Govanhill to the Roma victims of the Holocaust ethnic cleansing. Between 500,000 and 1.5 million of the Holocaust's 6 million victims were Roma. The theme of Holocaust Memorial Day for 2022 is one day. My one day is the 6th of July, 1939, the day I arrived in my new home in Britain. A refugee asked recently what home meant to him, replied, "Home is where, when you go there, they have to let you in." Such a sad remark. Our world today is full of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers fleeing war, civil unrest, poverty, or the effects of climate change. The days running up to Holocaust Memorial Day offer a chance not just to remember those who died in the Nazi genocide, but to think about all those suffering today, the fear and anxiety that goes along with displacement, with being forced to abandon one home and, if you're lucky, to make a new home somewhere else. I was once a refugee and shall speak today about my family's experiences as refugees. Our story may serve as a commentary on love and hate. The number of the dead is not the sole measure of the Jewish tragedy. I shall tell the personal stories of my secular Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, offensively called crossbreeds, who all came to Britain as exiles in 1939 and survived. I'm one of the few still alive to bear witness to that dreadful time. And you, therefore, are the very last generation to hear these stories firsthand. And as the so-called Third Reich slips from human memory, I join in Britain's promise to remember. We started off a respectable German family in Dortmund, which lies bang in the center of Europe. The four of us lived in a nice house in a fashionable part of the city, and my elder sister, Renata, went to the school with the children of other prosperous bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, we would have remained in that comfortable world indefinitely. But the shadows had been gathering since shortly before my birth in 1933, and it was not a good time to be Jewish. My father, Arnold Buchdahl, was a young judge, a brilliant but rather distant man with a single-minded devotion to principle that was slightly unworldly. I have a vivid early memory of going for a family walk in one of Dortmund's famous parks and stamping, for some reason, on a beetle. My father exploded into a blazing fury. "How would you like it if a great big foot came down and stamped on you?" he shouted. It was an extraordinary rage to direct at a mere toddler. Yet he did get his point through to me. My ethical compass certainly stems from him. In 1933, he was fired by edict of the Third Reich because of his Jewish ethnicity. Again and again, we were forced to move from city to city and eventually from country to country in search of work and security. We eventually settled in Vienna, my mother's home city. And when the Nazi plague infected Austria as well, the writing was on the wall for anyone who dared to read it. Jewish families who stayed in Central Europe faced catastrophe. One of my clearest recollections of that time is of walking with my mother to fetch my sister from school. I particularly remember part of the route going along a huge stone wall. I discovered two things about this memory when I revisited the city a few years after the war. First, the wall wasn't huge at all. It was I who had been small. And more importantly, there was a reason why we always went to collect her. It was because, even as a child, Renata was beginning to suffer from anti-Semitism. She was lucky to have a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get home under our escort without having "dirty Jew" shouted or stones thrown at her by her fellow pupils. It was my father who first faced up to the unthinkable reality that the once solid social framework in which our lives had been built had collapsed, leaving a choice between escape and eventual extinction. It was to be a descent into barbarism. By 1939, the borders were gradually closing. And when my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that my sister and I should be sent to England into the arms of strangers in order to save our lives. As you've heard, the Kindertransport organized its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Free City of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children, aged 5 to 16, and some small 17-year-olds also stuck in, with just 2 adults. There were also some girls, aged 16 plus, caring for babies. Of course, I did not know at the time that they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was almost certain death. Courage takes many forms, and I always salute the sheer heroism of those young carers. And recently learnt of one of them. Let me introduce Lily Reichenfeld, who made 2 such loving journeys of kindness and honored the guarantee given by a non-Jewish friend. Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and oblivion followed. I want to thank the Christian and Jewish activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Quaker Society of Friends who kept it going when it ran out of money, and the many volunteers who administered that largest ever recorded migration of children. But it was not a simple matter. Forms had to be filled in, documents stamped, permits queued for at seemingly deliberately inconvenient times, guarantees provided. We spent several weeks in a children's home so that my mother could devote herself full time to grappling with the obstacles of Nazi and British bureaucracy. As time ran out, people started to forge Home Office entry permits. No limit to the permitted number of children to be rescued was ever publicly announced, but Britain capped its number at 10,000. Compare that with the number of refugees Britain talks about admitting today. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found Renata and me foster parents in England who were prepared to prepay our future repatriation costs, about £5,000 in today's currency, and to guarantee that the 2 of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. We call them Uncle and Auntie, Guy and Ruby Smith. They nurtured us as they would their own children, and certainly I am their child in all but birth. Everyone told me to be grateful. Indeed, I am grateful, but also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honor their memories as I do all the uncles and aunties who helped us children through those terrible times. The fact that people I did not know saved us by doing what selfless, generous people do made a deep impression. We progressed from being called enemy aliens to, once somebody realized we were children, friendly enemy aliens, and post-war to being just friendly aliens. The shifting identity captures hate and happiness, villains and good guys, the fifth columnist or suspected terrorist, the refugee, the unwanted migrant, the asylum seeker, all present a useful outlet for people's fears. We were doubly lucky in that, unlike most of the parents who sent their children away on the Kindertransport, ours survived. Though, sadly, I never bonded with them again. Moving now to Greta, my Austrian mother. She was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family who had educated her to be a middle-class wife. Although my father wrote in 1940 that he feared my mother was lost, a euphemism used in front of children, she managed her own desperate escape to England by train, bribing her way across Europe at one vital stage with the coat she was wearing. What happened to her when she finally got to England, penniless and homeless, 4 days before war was declared? The regulations were such that she was only allowed to work in agriculture or domestic service. She chose the latter and cleaned somebody else's nice house before moving after some years to be a resident cook for a hostel of 40 schoolgirls. In 1951, she and I went through the naturalization process together. When the interviewer asked for her views on the 1948 partition of Israel, she paused before replying, "I think Britain behaved disgracefully, but this has always been a country of free speech, and we were granted citizenship. I was registered as a British minor, and it was my mother who took the oath of allegiance in front of a justice of the peace. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty, King George VI, his heirs and successors according to law." To further ease our integration, we took the opportunity to anglicize our names and chose Brooke to honor that most English of poets, Rupert Brooke. I found that name change empowering. One summer, my mother and I went to Vienna together, partly for her to search for family and friends, partly to dig up the silver which had been buried for safety. We made a grim train journey across Europe, weighed down with emotional baggage and expectation, before finally emerging in the glorious historic city from which we had escaped 20 years earlier. I was accosted kindly by a couple who asked, "Excuse us, are you from the camps?" Vienna had not seen a face like mine for some time. I looked around at its gracious avenues, ancient walls, grand palaces, and elegant squares. While previously I'd wept sentimentally on hearing Viennese music, now I realized in an instant that, lovely as it all was, the city meant nothing to me, and felt the weight of my past diminish. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of her few items from the past got broken. Her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods, which says a lot about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit is of my sister's preoccupation with evaluating the likely role of people we saw in the streets who would have been adults in the 1930s. What were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, the Jewish one of the family, so necessarily the first to escape, having walked over the mountains to neutral Switzerland and thence by train to England, he finished the war wearing a British Army uniform, which he'd acquired after a painful journey round the world. Stephen McKinney of the School of Education of this university has written about the widespread failure to differentiate genuine refugees from Nazis. And as an adult male German refugee, my father had been briefly interned before being deported in July 1940 to Australia. He went from Liverpool on the transport ship Dunera. They were guarded by soldiers on light duty after being shell-shocked at Dunkirk. In any event, they ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 58-day journey to Sydney, stole their valuables, and threw their suitcases overboard. The conditions on the grossly overcrowded voyage were so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. Those deportees who survived the journey, 2 died and more than 50 had to be hospitalized, then traveled to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the high security fence was almost unnecessary. The largely professional inmates made the best of their plight, printing their own money, creating their own system of law and order. My father served again as a judge, and developing not merely a cafe society, but also an unofficial university with remarkable educational and cultural programs, concerts, and much else. In May 1941, partly as the result of the outcry in Britain as families heard, despite all mail being censored, about the iniquity of their treatment, a substantial number of internees were released to join the Pioneer Corps. My father was among them. His release papers formally recorded his personal effects as nil, And so he found himself again in the United Kingdom. The Pioneer Corps was a relatively new auxiliary force dubbed the King's most loyal enemy aliens, which provided backup work for the conventional armed forces. And he started off digging ditches and such like. He was later transferred to head what became the Mid Wales Psychiatric Hospital, which was used to treat several hundred mentally ill prisoners of war. He used a pseudonym so that German patients would not know his original nationality. Some VIP visitors were surprised to meet a lowly staff sergeant in such a responsible role, but apparently that was by then the highest rank permitted to a non-Brit. Hitler had taken nationality away from Jewish families, so we'd all arrived stateless, but received some modicum of paperwork from Britain, formally acknowledging that we were displaced persons registered here. This was the so-called Nansen passport. I've always admired the polar explorer Nansen, who became such an effective diplomat and humanitarian. How glad I was later to get my British passport, with its reassurance that His Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires in the name of His Majesty all those who may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. To a certain extent, refugees became just like another group of evacuees. Starting August 1939, the 3.5 million people, mainly children, evacuated into safety from areas of danger. My image of wartime Britain is of a quiet country, where even outsiders like me could be confident that those in authority would generally do their best to do the right thing by us. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homeland from which they'd been driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his legal career in Germany. To move permanently to England would mean giving up the career dreams that defined him. My mother saw it differently. She had had a world in Germany, a life of comfort, status, and material security, and bit by bit, it had been stolen from her. Perhaps some of her very identity had been stolen with it. Having escaped with her life and little else, it was unthinkable to her that her husband should do anything but build a new life from scratch in England, just as she had done. The outcome was, to modern eyes, predictable. They divorced, and my father returned to Germany more or less immediately. Germany had entirely broken down. The contrast to the orderly societies of Britain couldn't have been stronger or more nightmarish. There was no money, no gas, no electricity, no clean water. The only semblance of civil structure was the crude military authority of the occupying allies. People were living in the cellars of ruined buildings, bartering sex for food, food to survive, using cigarettes as currency. Black marketeer, white slaver, there was no warmth in anyone's faces. Most were just blank from hunger and fear. We had lived through 6 years of the most devastating war in human history, but this was our first glimpse of its utter dehumanizing horror and destruction. Shortly before the German surrender, my father had left the Pioneer Corps, collected his demob suit, and transferred into the American Army, which needed educated German speakers to help with the post-war administration of what remained of the country. He was employed as a junior researcher, but at least from his point of view, it was a step back into a world he understood, especially when mechanisms began to be set up for putting Nazi war criminals on trial. He worked on the role Adolf Eichmann had played at the infamous Wannsee conference, at which the final solution was agreed. And at one point, he was called to give expert evidence on the precise linguistic nuances of the phrase Polish subhumanity and its use in German legal circles in the 1930s. Let me refocus on the shared Kindertransport experiences of we two children. Me at age 5, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. It's hard, after all these years, to be certain how many of the remembered details of the 2.5-day journey are real, and how much I have added to my mental picture from other sources. Was the July weather outside really grey? Or have I just seen too many black and white photographs of the Kindertransport? I have read that some of the trains were sealed, but surely one boy in our carriage kept getting off to be sick during the train's many unscheduled stops. Or was that just a dream? I'm pretty certain that we slept on large strips of corrugated cardboard on the floor, as well as on the long wooden benches that lined the sides of the carriages. I believe that at some point in the train journey, children also slept in the overhead luggage racks, although the scene in my mind's eye is different from the archived carriage photographs I've seen since. I presume that I slept, though I can't remember doing so. I think my mother had given us food for the journey, but again, I may be wrong. I remember the occasional frightening interruptions from uniformed guards, nasty they were, and recall vividly the cold, oily smell of the sea, an entirely new experience when we finally reached the channel at the Hook of Holland, and vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing to Harwich. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at London's Liverpool Street station, the platform was silent. Silent. It seemed somehow implausible, and perhaps I've merely projected the numbness of my emotions onto the past. Nonetheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. Hundreds of dirty, unwashed children spilling out onto the platform, speechless and wide-eyed. We had numbered labels hanging around our necks as if we were lost property. In a sense, we were. Renata also had an expensive Leica camera slung round her person, to be later sold, of course, because one was permitted to bring out a camera, but no money. She and I waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled mattresses in a cavernous hall. There were two Kindertransport memorial statues at Liverpool Street Station. The smaller one of a young boy with a suitcase by Flor Kent, and the other of a group of child refugees by Frank Meisler, who was himself one of those saved. The 2006 plaque dedicated by the Association of Jewish Refugees, our sponsors today, reads, "In gratitude to the people of Britain for saving the lives of 10,000 unaccompanied, mainly Jewish children who fled from Nazi persecution in 1938 and 1939. And it quotes the sacred Talmud, "Whoever rescues a single soul is credited as though they had saved the whole world." In 2011, a Kindertransport Memorial bench was unveiled in Harwich, located to face the shipping lane in the North Sea, and that was from where most of us first saw this green and pleasant land. And later this year, Harwich's important role in the Kindertransport will be recognized with a beautiful memorial on the quayside. May Ian Walter's sculpture, this is part of the bold, stimulate the next generation to learn about the Kindertransport and to support today's child refugees. Britain was one of the very few countries who allowed us refugee children in 1939. What have we contributed in return? My sister Renata never settled as well as I did and remained an exile in spirit. Unlike with the Windrush generation, the Home Office invited her to British citizenship when she was 18, but she declined several Home Office invitations to apply for British citizenship until its final letter suggested that if she did not wish to become British, having been to school here and so on, by implication, she should go back to where she came from. And that she certainly did not wish to do. She emigrated to Australia on a £10 assisted passage and applied for Australian citizenship after only 6 months. I've often thought about this. We didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us children. And as now an adult, she had ceased to be a victim and could make things happen rather than having things happen to her. She chose Australia, and having requalified there, contributed significantly to its childcare practices, sublimating the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the Vietnamese boat children, into adoptive and foster families. Married to an Australian, she adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. As for me, I was now a British citizen and at 18 started in the family tradition of public service, later to go into business to get round all the gender issues of the time. Like many refugees, migrants and exiles, I have apparently an uncommon level of drive and determination and choose to contribute to the society in which I live. Thus, my childhood trauma was transformed into entrepreneurship. I was a pioneer of computing and a pathfinder in the professionalism of women. An entrepreneur in the early 60s, sharing ownership with the staff. When the company was acquired after 45 years, it was a public company in the FTSE 250, employing over 8,000 people. And I'm a strategic giver away of my self-made wealth. Let me come to my conclusion. It would have been good to be able to say that the exile of our nuclear family led to a vibrant new dynasty in Britain. But not one of us refreshed the gene pool. My father resettled in the land of his birth. Amazingly, after his round-the-world travels, his 1933 dismissal letter, one short paragraph, officiously rubber-stamped, was found among his papers when he died. My sister migrated to Australia. My mother and I remained here, though she would have scored high in any measure of nostalgia and never understood the British sense of humor. My only child died. The story of the Holocaust is a terrible one. But where there are shadows, there must be light. So let us remember the many beautiful stories from those terrible times. Not only the Kindertransport, but also other escapes, such as the 600 children saved by Sir Nicholas Winton and his mother from German-occupied Czechoslovakia, and the 300 children who had somehow survived in concentration camps, who were brought to England in 1945, the so-called Windermere children, to be later integrated into British society. And the 180 ultra-Orthodox Kindertransportees who found safe haven in a castle in Wales and trained in agriculture to prepare for their future life on a religious kibbutz in Israel. As part of Britain's promise to remember, we honor all victims of Nazi persecution and the genocides in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, the list goes on. Let our words and deeds be of love for our neighbors, respecting and cherishing our differences. Thank you.